Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Another video is here for you today, and this one is about a special topic in astrology. Basically, I'll be reading from a book called Cosmos and Psyche, and I'm going to be reading the section about Saturn and Pluto transits. The title of the chapter is called Cycles of Crisis and Contraction, and the title of the section is called World Wars, Cold War, and September 11th. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's about 10 pages long, so this will probably be like a 40-minute video. And if you'd like to speed it up, you could click the gear button below and click 1.5 speed or 2 times speed, so that if this is too slow for you, it can go faster. Basically, if this is your first time to my channel, I'm Kyle. I make any kind of video I want, and I post whenever I want, so there's not much consistency yet to my channel. However, you definitely should subscribe and give it a thumbs up and comment below. I'm making this video because I got a comment basically that said they enjoyed my book club series where I read from a book. So far, I've made about 4 videos from the book Cosmos and Psyche. I think I read about the first 60 pages on camera. So if you'd want to go back and watch those, it kind of explains some of the main theses of this book, which is about psychology's relationship to astrology and astrology's relationship to modernity, and how rational thought and modern thought kind of exclude the possibilities for more mystical thought. How that's still really important, and we need to figure out a way to kind of rectify them and stuff, and think about how meaning emerges from patterns and systems of language and stuff, and how the outer and the inner worlds are connected. Anyway, so in January 2020, January 12th, I believe, Saturn and Pluto will be in the same exact place in the sky in Capricorn at 22 degrees, which is a master number in numerology. And the Sun will also be in Capricorn, I believe, very close by at 23 degrees. Capricorn? No, the Sun will be in Capricorn too, and so will Jupiter will be in Capricorn. Let me just look it up really quick. Basically, it's a big day. Saturn and Pluto are rarely in the same degree. I think the cycle happens, I don't know how many years, 80 years I want to say, but I'm not sure. So let's go to January 12th. I use the website planetwatcher.com. It's not the Sun. Oh no, yeah, the Sun is at 22 degrees Capricorn. So is Pluto and Saturn. And at 23 degrees Capricorn is Mercury. And then at 9 degrees Capricorn is Jupiter. So that is wild, right? 22 is one of the most powerful numbers in numerology. And so basically, what does this mean, right? Why am I going on about this? Capricorn is a sign of rules, boundaries, limits, learning lessons, maturity, age. It constricts, and it's about structure. In Capricorn, the sign is about a lot of the same things. It's about achievement, structures, structural realities. And Pluto is the planet of kind of like destruction in a way, or power, really. Transformational power, deep transformation, revolutionary kind of turnover. The Sun is the planet of ego, identity, strength, action. And Mercury is the planet of communications, knowledge, in a sense, thoughts and speech and travel, small travel, and messages and stuff like that. So having them all together is going to mean that these forces are going to kind of combine in a very Capricornian way, which, like I said, will be kind of boss. It's going to be... it might be a big mess, basically. We don't know. It might mean something's going to end. Something really big will end. People don't really know yet, but what we can do is look to the past when similar astrological occurrences were happening with Saturn and Pluto, and we could see kind of patterns in the past of history, so we could kind of expect what's going to happen in January 2020, even though we won't know until it happens, really. So with that being all said, I think we should start reading from the book. World Wars, Cold War, and September 11th. We will now examine the planetary cycle of Pluto with Saturn, which in important respects bears a resemblance to the Uranus-Pluto cycle. The previous part of this book is about Uranus-Pluto. This is I'm skipping to page 209 in this book. We're just starting at a random point, basically, for the relevance of Pluto and Saturn. So, while the Uranus-Pluto periods consistently coincided with widespread revolutionary upheaval, the successive quadrature alignments of the Saturn-Pluto cycle coincided with especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction, eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. An atmosphere of gravity and tension tended to accompany these 3 to 4 year periods, as did a widespread sense of epochal closure, the end of an era, the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life that in retrospect may seem to have been marked by widespread indulgence, decadence, naivete, denial, and inflation. Profound transformation was a dominant theme, as with the Uranus-Pluto cycle, but here the transformation was through contraction, conservative reaction, crisis, and termination. Both the First World War and the Second World War began in precise coincidence with virtually exact hard aspect alignments of Saturn and Pluto in August 1914 and September 1939, respectively. The most recent Saturn-Pluto alignment occurred in precise coincidence with the events of September 11, 2001, the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York, and the attack on the Pentagon in Washington, and the many events set into motion in its wake. In the first half of September 2001, Saturn and Pluto were within 2 degrees of exact opposition. Many astrologers had speculated, both in print and in private, about what might take place during this alignment, including the strong possibility of terrorism. Within moments of the attacks of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11th, virtually every astrologer in the country knew that the forces symbolized in the Saturn-Pluto alignment, an alignment that had coincided in the past with so many grim periods of historical crisis and contraction, had erupted. The vivid complex of qualities, emotions, and meanings connected with those grave events fits with remarkable precision the synthesis of archetypal principles associated with those 2 planets in combination, expressed in their most extreme form, both negatively and positively, profoundly weighty events of enduring consequence, violence and death on a massive scale, the irrevocable termination of an established order of existence, collective intensification of division, antagonism, and hostility, the deployment of massive, highly disciplined, carefully organized, destructive power, and a widespread sense of victimization and suffering under the impact of cataclysmic and oppressive forces of history. More generally, this archetype complex tended to constellate a widespread sense that one's life was determined and constrained by large impersonal forces of many kinds: historical, political, military, social, economic, judicial, biological, elemental, instinctual, too powerful and dominant to be affected by the individual self. This sense of vulnerability was in turn regularly matched by a drive for power, control, and domination. Sometimes the two sides of this large gestalt were constellated simultaneously in two opposing persons or groups, one predatory, the other victimized. Yet, just as often, the two sides were constellated simultaneously with the same person, group, or nation, each part of the complex unconsciously eliciting the other. Experiences of deep humiliation caused by violence, violation, and defeat were thus then accompanied by a compensatory need to prove one's steely strength, invulnerability, and capacity to retaliate with lethal potency. Saturn-Pluto alignment periods are also characterized by displays of personal and collective determination, unbending will. Oh, sorry for that notification. Okay, I'm distracted. Okay. Personal and collective determination, unbending will, courage, and sacrifice by intensely focused, silent, strenuous effort in the face of danger and death, by a deepening capacity for moral discernment born from experience and suffering, and by the transformation and forging of enduring structures, whether material, political, or psychological. The events of September 11th constituted an extraordinary human tragedy and represented a dark, consequential moment in human history. This was especially true for people of New York and the United States, but because the searing images of the event were instantly transmitted throughout the world, the impact of the attack was to a great extent felt by people everywhere. The events drew forth a powerful, sustained response in the following weeks and months. Emotional and existential, political and military, morally reflective. Horrific violence was visited upon many other peoples during this alignment period. Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, Spain, Sudan, Kenya, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Bali, some directly connected with September 11th events, some as part of a synchronic wave of terror and death that marked the years of this alignment. In all these respects, the events of September 11th and their aftermath resembled other periods of great historical gravity, and with remarkable consistency, those periods coincided with the quadrature alignments of the planet's Pluto cycle. So, the quadrature alignments of the planet Pluto, of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, just means that those two planets are going to make square angles. There's 4 different ones. There's opposition, there's 2 squares, and then there's a conjunction. So either they're in the same place, they're opposite, or they're 90 degrees away from each other. And at each of these 90-degree markings, that would be what the quadrature alignments of Saturn-Pluto cycle are. As an archetypal principle, Saturn has long been associated with a complex of meanings that, while multivalent and diverse, nevertheless possess a certain easily discernible coherence and consistency. The hard structures and limitations of material reality and mortal existence, contraction and constraint, deprivation and negation, division and conflict, gravity and gravitas, necessity and finality, the endings of things. Saturn presses things to their conclusion and defines them in their finitude. It expresses itself in such existential realities as aging and maturity, death and dying, labor and duty, suffering and hardship, the weight of time in the past, the wisdom of experience. It governs authority, solidity, security, reliability, established tradition, the status quo, order and system, that which endures and sustains. The Saturn archetype encompasses all that involves boundaries and limits. It defines and grounds, constricts and solidifies. It expresses itself in discipline and control, rigor and rigidity, repression and oppression. It rules judgment, guilt, the consequences of past actions, error and fault, defeat and failure, deflation and decline, depression and sorrow. Saturn is, in Nietzsche's phrase, the spirit of gravity, both heavy and dark. In Freud's terms, it is the reality principle, the delays and resistances to gratification, the obstacles and diminishments presented by life's exigencies. Saturn is the conveyor of the hard truth, naked, unadorned, instructive, sobering, often painful. It is the bottom line, the workings of necessity, the inevitable and inescapable. In major aspects between two planets, of which one is Saturn, the corresponding phenomena suggest that Saturn archetype tends to combine itself with the second principle in such a way as to express its characteristic qualities and themes of contraction, realism, division, deprivation, materiality, hardship, judgment, authority, and so forth. But in this case, through and by means of the archetypal principle associated with Pluto. With hard aspects in particular, the Saturn principle tends to bring out the problematic potential of whatever it touches, while in other respects opposing or negating that second planetary principle. Its archetypal influence seems also to be one of moving events towards critical and defining junctures. Just as during Uranus-Pluto alignments, the archetypal principle associated with Pluto appeared to empower and intensify the Promethean impulse of rebellion and innovation and change and urge for freedom, so too during Saturn-Pluto alignments, the Plutonic principle seemed to empower and intensify each of the above-mentioned Saturnian tendencies and qualities to an often overwhelming degree on a massive scale. Besides this intensifying and empowering influence, the Pluto archetype also appeared to add into the larger complex its own distinctive qualities involving instinctual and elemental forces, titanic power and violent intensity, violation and destruction, chthonic and underworld depths, and evolutionary transformation. With these archetypal principles in mind, we can begin to observe the extraordinary consistency with which periods of profound historical gravity, crisis, and contraction coincided with successive major alignments of the Saturn-Pluto cycle. As with the Uranus-Pluto cycle examined in the preceding chapters, the evidence suggests striking correlations involving the sequence of consecutive conjunction and opposition alignments. For the sake of simplicity and clarity, when reviewing the distinctive pattern correlations for the Uranus-Pluto cycle, I restricted our attention through much of the initial analysis of the two axial alignments, the conjunction and opposition, bringing in the square alignment only in the later sections. Here, we will include from the beginning the full sequence of the four quadrature alignments of Saturn and Pluto in their ongoing cycle. Again, these alignments are the conjunction, 0 degrees, the opposition, 180 degrees, and the two intervening squares, 90 degrees, which are collectively known as the major hard aspects. These are equivalent in the lunar cycle to the new moon, the full moon, and the two intervening positions, the waning last quarter and the waxing first quarter. The orb for the years given in all these chapters for conjunctions and oppositions of outer planet world transits is approximately 15 degrees, while the orb for the intervening squares is somewhat smaller, approximately 10 degrees, with a proportionately smaller penumbra. When you talk about the orb, it just means are we going to count a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto at only when they're 0 degrees apart? This person is saying, no, actually, we should consider it as far as 15 degrees apart. So currently, right now, Saturn and Pluto have been in a dance where they are very close. So we can kind of consider this time a Saturn-Pluto conjunction time, even though the exact date when there will be 0 degrees apart at 22 degrees Capricorn will be January 12th, 2020. Okay, continuing. The first Saturn-Pluto conjunction of the 20th century coincided with the immediate build-up to and eruption of World War I in 1913 and 1916, first moving to exact alignment during the 3 months of August, September, and October of 1914, when most of the nations of Europe in rapid succession declared war on each other and mobilized their immense armies to begin the horrific slaughter of the following months and years throughout the conjunction period and beyond. In turn, the immediately following first square in 1921 to 23 coincided with the decisive emergence of fascism and totalitarianism in Europe, marked by Mussolini's coming to power in Italy, Stalin's seizure of the Communist Party machinery in the Soviet Union, and the beginning of Hitler's rise in Germany, leading to the beer hall push in Munich. The next such alignment, the opposition that extended from 1930 to 1933 coincided with worldwide economic crisis and the rapid ascendancy of Nazism in Germany and the beginning of Hitler's dictatorship, the rise of the Japanese militarism and the invasion of Manchuria in China, and the intensified dominance of Stalin's totalitarian control in the Soviet Union, his politics of forced collectivization, and the beginning of the mass starvation of over 7 million Ukrainians. Finally, the closing square coincided precisely with the beginning of World War II in 1939 to 41, first moving up to 1 degree of exact alignment in August and September of 1939 as Germany invaded Poland. This alignment continued through the darkest period of Nazi dominance in Europe, the Blitzkrieg, the fall of France, and most of the other nations of Western and Northern Europe, the harrowing Battle of Britain, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler's formulation of the final solution, and the beginning of the Holocaust. It was also in this period, August 1939, when the alignment was first exact, that Einstein, fearful of German nuclear research, signed the fateful letter to Roosevelt urging the U.S. government to develop an atomic bomb, which he later considered the greatest mistake of his life. The Manhattan Project began in the ensuing months during this alignment. This cyclical pattern of diachronically related historical events possessing the same archetypal character began again with the immediately following conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which occurred in 1946 to 48 in precise coincidence with the beginning of the Cold War, the establishment of the Iron Curtain, and the domination of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. Both terms, Iron Curtain and Cold War, first emerged at this time, each highly characteristic of the archetypal complex associated with the Saturn-Pluto cycle. The rigid, impenetrable boundary separating implacable enemies, the armored state of permanent hostility, the relentlessly frigid geopolitical climate, the atmosphere of historical darkness and gravity, the sustained global condition in which catastrophic destructive power was simultaneously poised and held in check by the fear of mutual annihilation. The period of this conjunction brought a wave of events strongly suggestive of this archetypal complex, the beginning of the global nuclear arms race, the beginning of U.S. atomic bomb testing in the South Pacific, the escalation of systematic Cold War espionage, and the smuggling of atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, the succession of communist takeovers and establishment of totalitarian governments in Albania, Yugoslavia, etc., the Berlin blockade crisis with the Soviet Union and Western allies, the rapid ascendancy of communism under Mao in China, the communist takeover of North Korea, the founding of NATO, the establishment of the CIA, the rise of the anti-communist Cold War establishment and mentality in the U.S. It was also during this conjunction in 1948 that apartheid was instituted in South Africa and the rise to power of the right-wing Afrikaner National Party. The successive cyclical conjunctions of these two planets occur approximately every 31 to 37 years, depending on Pluto's orbital position and speed. Since Pluto's orbit isn't exactly circle, it's kind of like a long oval. In the sequence of Saturn-Pluto alignments during the 20th century, we can observe how the three successive conjunctions coincided with defining events and decisions that established an enduring historical foundation upon which causally related developments would then unfold for several decades afterward. In broad terms, the first conjunction of the 20th century that coincided with the onset of the First World War in 1914 essentially marked the commencement of the 20th century's 30 Years' War that engulfed Europe and then the world, critically unfolding from the point through the Second World War in close association with the successive quadrature aspects of those two planets during those 3 decades between 1914 and 1945. In turn, the second Saturn-Pluto conjunction of the century coincided precisely with the beginning of the Cold War in 1946 to 48, which unfolded in a similar manner and was closely correlated with that cycle's successive quadrature alignments. The following square of 1955 to 57 coincided with Soviet Union's reoccupation of Hungary, its crushing of dissent in Poland, and intensified threats against the West. The midpoint of the cycle, the opposition of 1964 to 67, coincided precisely with the start of the U.S. war in Vietnam and its rapid escalation. The following square of 1973 to 75 brought the U.S. defeat in Vietnam and the takeover by communist regimes in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And then there's kind of a chart here. It says the Saturn Pluto cycle, quadrature alignments since 1914. So let's see. So right. So there's a chart here which it just shows the dates when it goes through each of these four positions, and it ends with the conjunction that will be happening. It says December 29 to January 2020, or December 2019 to January 2020. That's when the exact alignment is. But the larger alignment is actually from January 28th to December 2021. Okay, so I think I just have to pause here, and I'll start the video again in a minute. Okay, I'm back. Let's finish this chapter. The concluding alignment of this cycle, the last conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in the 20th century, began in late 1980 and extended from 1981 through most of 1984. At this time, the global nuclear arms race, the escalation of the Cold War antagonism, and widespread fear of nuclear apocalypse reached its climax during the first Reagan administration and the final years of the pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union. And during the period of this conjunction, the global situation was marked by massively increased defensive armoring, rigidly established boundaries, hostile separation, mutual demonization. Example, Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Intensive military buildups and repressive military action and state-sponsored terrorism in many parts of the world. Characteristic events of these years included the activities of death squads, militant ascendancy of Islamic extremists in Central Asia, and the West-supported rise of military aggression by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This same cycle is also clearly visible and closely correlated with the series of Middle East crisis and Arab-Israeli wars that began with the period of Middle Eastern war and terrorism in 1946 to 48, out of which was founded modern Israel and Palestine during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the start of the Cold War. This was followed in most clock-like fashion by the consecutive sequence of wars in the Middle East: the Suez War of 1956, square; the 6 Days War in 1967, opposition; the Yom Kippur War of 1973, square; and Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, conjunction. This last alignment, the conjunction of 1981 to 84, coincided as well with the sustained massive slaughter of the Iran-Iraq War, the Falklands War between Britain and Argentina, and the depths of the Soviet War in Afghanistan that led to the rise of Islamic jihadist movement, fueled by clandestine U.S. support. The entire sequence of the Middle East wars just cited occurred in uncannily close coincidence with the sequence of quadrature alignments between Saturn and Pluto. This pattern has continued unabated during the most recent Saturn-Pluto opposition, both with the United States-led Iraq War in 2003 and the sustained Israel-Palestine crisis of 2000 to 2004, with its traumatic cycle of suicide bombings and retaliatory repression. A parallel pattern is evident in correlation with the same cycle during the same period for India and Pakistan, beginning with India's independence and partition in 1947 to 48, and the massive destruction that occurred at that time, the assassination of Gandhi by a Hindu extremist, and the deaths of millions in the unleashed sectarian violence. The quadrature correlations again continued in succession up through the most recent Saturn-Pluto opposition, which coincided with the Kashmir crisis, nuclear standoff, and repeated acts of mass violence and retribution between Hindus and Muslims in 2000 and 2004. Thus, the first Saturn-Pluto cycle of the 20th century correlated closely with the World Wars, and the second with the Cold War. The events that have coincided with the successive quadrature aspects of the third, though we are still in the middle of it, have up to this point closely correlated with the phenomenon of international terrorism and the ensuing war on terror. The conjunction of 1981 to 84 discussed above in relation to the Cold War and the Middle East wars also coincided with the initial terrorist bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the U.S. and French barracks in Lebanon, which have been called the most consequential terrorist acts before the World Trade Center attack that occurred under the following opposition. This same conjunction of 1981 to 84 also coincided with the sudden wave of other major terrorist acts: Ireland, France, Iran, Philippines, assassinations, Anwar Sadat in Egypt, Indira Gandhi in India, Benigno Aquino in the Philippines, and assassination attempts, Pope John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, in many parts of the world. In turn, the following Saturn-Pluto square of 1992 to 94 exactly coincided with the First World Trade Center bombing, Osama bin Laden's first call for a jihad against America, and the coming to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Finally, the most recent opposition coincided with the full emergence of international terrorism and the war on terror with the events of September 11, 2001, and many measures of repression, retribution, government-sponsored violence, and further acts of terrorist response that followed in the wake. The alignment first reached exactitude in August to September 2001 in coincidence with the destruction of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon, followed by the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and its final pass to within 3 degrees of exactitude occurred in March 2003 in coincidence with the invasion of Iraq and its shock and awe tactics of overwhelming destruction. The long period of violence and terror in Iraq that continued after the invasion, which included the abuse and torture of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. military and paramilitary personnel, and gruesome beheadings and suicide bombings by Islamist and Iraqi resistance forces, began in coincidence with the later stages of the Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2003 to 2004. This phase of the transit included the terrorist bombings in Madrid and the prisoner abuse and torture scandal of Abu Ghraib, which emerged as the alignment approached the final 15-degree point. In a parallel with the larger cyclical unfolding of geopolitical structures and historically consequential events, the United States invasion of Iraq was also widely viewed as bringing an end to the post-war world order that had been based on the multilateral Western European American alliance and its fundamental support of the United Nations. Parallel developments in terror, retaliation, oppression, and conservative empowerment took place in the same years in Russia under Putin, where continuing violent conflict with Chechnyan insurgents served as justification for a more general neo-Stalinization of Russian political life. And it's a mouthful, but, we're just getting the history here. Remarkably, the age of modern terrorism is widely considered to have begun in 1946 with the bombing of the King David Hotel by Zionist radicals, in coincidence with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1946 to 48. That also coincided with the beginning of the Cold War. Such historically defining Saturn-Pluto cycles consistently took place in earlier centuries, such as the conjunction that occurred in 1618 and the beginning of the original 30 Years' War that started in that year and soon spread throughout Europe. All of the continent was ravaged by a state of nearly continuous, unprecedentedly brutal warfare for 30 years until 1648, precisely coincident with the next Pluto-Saturn conjunction, one full cycle later, as also happened in the 30-year period encompassing World War I and World War II in the 20th century. Another such defining conjunction was that of 1348 to 1351 that coincided with the eruption and spread of the Black Death, which similarly devastated Europe and set in motion cultural and economic shifts that permanently transformed European life in the late medieval period. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, began in China in 1333 in coincidence with the preceding Saturn-Pluto opposition and reached a climax in Europe in 1348 to 51 during the conjunction. A comparable pattern can be discerned with the AIDS epidemic, which first widely emerged and was identified during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1981 to 84, and which reached pandemic proportions worldwide, especially in Africa, during the following Saturn-Pluto opposition of 2000 to 2004. Whenever adequate historical records were available, I found that simultaneous occurrences of multiple categories of diverse but archetypally connected events during Saturn-Pluto alignments occurred consistently throughout history. To take one example of such a synchronic wave, the first Saturn-Pluto conjunction of the 13th century took place during the years of 1210 to 1213, much like the first conjunction of the 20th century in 1914 and 1916. Wars and mass violence pervaded much of Europe during the period of this alignment, driven by conflicts between the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, and by the efforts of Pope Innocent III to extirpate heretics and infidels and subjugate the political enemies of the Church. In these same years, the peace-loving Cathars in southern France were persecuted and burned at the stake as part of the Albigensian Crusade. In 1212, during the same period, the Children's Crusade set out for the Holy Land. The result was the loss of approximately 50,000 children, many kidnapped by slave dealers. In Asia, during the same conjunction in 1211 to 1212, the Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan began his massive invasion of China. The correlation of the Saturn-Pluto cycle with genocide, ethnocide, and mass killings is striking. In the past century, these include the mass killings of the Armenians by the Ottoman Turks during the conjunction of 1914 to 1915, the death of millions of kulaks under Stalin that began during the opposition of 1930 to 1933, Hitler's conceiving of the final solution and mass killing of Jews, which began during the Square of 1939 to 1941, the slaughter of nearly 1 million Indonesians by the right-wing military regime of 1965 to 1966, the Khmer Rouge's killing of over 1 million Cambodians that began during the Square of 1973 to 1975, the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala during the conjunction of 1981 to 1984, the mass killings of Bosnia and Rwanda during the Square of 1992 to 1994, and most recently the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Sudanese in the Darfur region in the hands of their own government during the conjunction of 2000 to 2004. Finally, one example of many from classical antiquity is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that coincided with the most intensive period of barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, those of 410 to 412 by the Huns, Vandals, and Visigoths. Led by Alaric, the Visigoths sacked Rome, burned and pillaging the ancient world's most powerful city in August 410, when Saturn and Pluto were 2 degrees exact from alignment, strikingly suggestive of a parallel with the terrorist destruction in New York, the modern world's most powerful city, on September 11th, 2001, when the same 2 planets were again 2 degrees from exact alignment. Okay, great. So, there's actually so much more. There's so many more chapters, actually, about the Saturn-Pluto alignment in here. There's 3 more chapters. The next one is called Historical Contrasts and Tensions, and then the next one is called Conservative Empowerment. And I think I'd like to read them too, because we're in a time right now of Saturn-Pluto alignment where we are kind of at, part of this quadrature pattern is happening right now. So I think it's cool to kind of just read about other periods of time when this was happening, and so this was just the first installment, I guess, of a few I want to do. Thank you for watching. If you found this informative at all, if you gleaned anything from it, from it, just let me know in the comments. If you hated this, let me know too. Again, I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'm trying to decide like what kind of content I want to put out there. I think reading books is a really good one because it's something you could fall asleep to. It's something you could learn from. It's like an audiobook. Is this type of content interesting to you? I'm really interested in astrology, so for me it was really good to read this, and I will read the next 2 parts about Saturn and Pluto. So you could look forward to that. If you want to know when I post videos, you have to subscribe and ring the bell below. If you give this video a thumbs up, that will let me know that you enjoy this kind of content and that you made it to the end. Thank you for watching, everyone. Peace out.